Hello everybody and welcome to Premiere 202, Premiere Pro for the Filmmaker. We're on class 3 this week. We're going to be talking about the interview. We have shot James Douglas Shields' interview and we'll teach the tricks on how to properly actually shoot an interview because this is a Premiere Pro for the Filmmaker. And we're going to teach you how to edit and some interview techniques and questions that'll help you out, and then how to cut down your interview and also develop the story as you work through your interview. I have the rough interview right here. We're going to teach how to cut this down. And I've already gone ahead and synced the audio from the Zoom H4n to the 5D Mark II footage using Pluralize. We're going to go more into those techniques, exactly how I did that next week. But I wanted to get this footage out to you now so you can start to cut it down with me and go through those keyboard shortcuts we went through before, start to use your data management to get it all archived and located like we've talked about before, and start to really implement these techniques. Before we get started actually cutting this interview though, I want to talk a little bit about conducting the interview. And this is really important because, it's not just about coming to and having a great edit. Everybody's doing more and more with projects these days. Even though you're an editor, you might be asked to film, or you might be asked to provide feedback to the director or producer or client on some interview questions that would help you later on. So you really want to be kind of aware of a project as best you can from the start. It'll help you later on. That's not always the case if you're a freelance editor, but if you are filming your own content, which more and more people are doing these days, these are going to help you a lot in the editing process. The first thing is we really want to develop a great story out of our content. And, our edit here is James and the behind the scenes and what he, is as a photographer and how he interacts with his models and the people around him. So we want to ask him the right questions, but more importantly, we want to learn and care about who he is. And you really want to listen, and this seems pretty basic, but you want to listen to your subject, and really learn what they're saying throughout the process. Along with that, you really have to do your homework prior to showing up to an interview. And you'll learn this if you're an editor later on and you're editing down somebody else's content that didn't properly prepare for the interview, because it'll just be all over the place. And we're going to cover later on about taking, hundreds of hours of footage and cutting them down and how to do that in Premiere, or one interview and how to properly organize that and cut that down. But it's really important when you have all this content that there's some kind of structure and organizations, and you have your questions written out beforehand, and you know what you're talking to. You know what you're talking about to the person. You want to create some kind of structure for your questions. And this also goes into when you have lots of content. I just got off a long project, working on a concert tour, filming a massive artist, and we filmed almost 20 hours of interviews and had to cut it down. I had to cut all the interviews down to about a 26-minute pitch in less than a week. I actually had about 3 or 4 days to do the bulk of the editing, getting very little to no sleep. But the point is, the only way I was able to cut that stuff down is I had structure to the questions that I was asking my subjects. They all had a similar kind of structure, whether I was interviewing fans or was interviewing the artist or the band or the people behind the scenes, setting up the stage and things. They all had their own set of interview questions, and that enables you to edit down each set of interview questions into groups, into different timelines, and then you can start to develop sub-stories. And sub-stories are extremely important. You want to think about all these before you show up to a project if you're filming it. And if you're editing it, you have to ask the director, producer, or the client what those sub-stories are, what the general story of the project is, so you end up with something that's just not all over the place. If you're asking interview questions, things like pausing before asking a new question, this is important not only for the subject, because they have an opportunity to say something else that could be even better than what they had said, what if you had cut them off, because a lot of human communication is trying to, talk to somebody else and cut them off on something short because you have something you want to say. But you have to take a step back and just listen, like we talked about before. And that'll help you also in the edit, because you want to have those nice clean breaks that'll help you cut better, instead of your voice like interrupting something they're saying if they're saying a good comment. And sometimes you really get the best answers when you just pause and let them finish, or just let them keep talking. You'd be surprised. And fewer words, less is more. Less is more in everything. We'll talk about that later in editing when it comes to color correction and it comes to some of the effects that we're going to use and things like that. But less is more, and also when you're talking to somebody. When you ask a question, you don't have to go off on this long paragraph about what you're trying to get out of them. Just ask a couple words. If they don't answer it the way you want it, then you can kind of ask them a couple more words and kind of lean them towards that. But you don't have to overwhelm them with a long, drawn-out question. Going along with that, like I said, if they do get stuck at a point and you're not getting the answer you want, go in and help them out, and kind of that really helps with that research we talked about and knowing kind of what you want out of the story and kind of driving them through the story. I do a lot of cinematic documentary filmmaking, and a lot of documentary filmmaking develops over time with the story and the interview and the editing as you go back and forth and you start to figure out these different sub-stories over time. But you also need to have some kind of set script developed beforehand. Otherwise, you will just lose your mind because you could go in so many different directions. So you kind of want to have some structure. You want to know going into a project where you kind of want to steer your interviewees so you can kind of get the story that you're going after in the first place. You're not putting words in your mouth, but you're just steering them in the direction of the things they would normally say so they can say it the right ways and get the right questions out of them, the right answers. Try to ask the question later if you didn't get the exact question you wanted straight up. So if you ask somebody an interview question and it's not the right answer you wanted immediately, don't try and just re-ask them over and over again until you get something. Just let it go, ask different questions, come back to that later, that same question, and rephrase it in a different way. And after you get people more comfortable and more relaxed and you've learned more about them and you've listened to them, you'll find out a better way to ask that interview question later. It's great to create momentum and pacing throughout the interview process, and you'll really notice this while you start to edit it up. As you are asking different questions and challenging the more confrontational ones, you'll get a lot more dramatic questions or more emotional answers later on down the line, and that'll really help you develop your story in the edit. Scouting out or doing a recon before you actually show up to a filming location, if possible. If you have that opportunity, please go do it, because you'll be able to set out where you want to do lights or where you want to set up your talent, or if you can't because you show up at the moment because you only have this certain amount of time, which is a lot of the circumstances, don't be afraid to try and move things around or try and convince somebody to move to a better location where it's not as noisy or you have a better opportunity to get better light or things like that. Talking about light, find good light, natural light if you use a window, or bring your own lights to set up. It'll really help your interview, obviously, and that's one of the fundamentals there. A lot of these are pretty basic, but I want to cover them just because a lot of you might be editors from the past and haven't done a lot of filming, and now you're starting to do a little bit more filming, or you're an editor and you've been editor for a long time and you see this content come in, and you can help develop other filmmakers or the client beforehand, if possible, things that will help you with the edit, because all these things are just going to make your life easier when you start to cut this stuff down. If you can film multiple angles or set up 2 camera positions, that way you can get a wide and a close up, and it just helps a little with variety. If you can't do that, it's better to at least zoom in or change the framing a little bit throughout the interview of certain sections, and then where you have different looks to cut to. And then find a quiet location. If you can, please hire a sound mixer. I've been doing filmmaking for a while and editing for a while, and I'm not an expert sound mixer by any means. Most of the productions we go on, we have a professional sound mixer, and that is extremely important, and sound is sometimes underrated because everybody says, well, you can just do it in post, and it's not. Just like anything else, it's not. You want to get everything up front prior to, including the good interview questions and the story developed and the color and the light and especially the sound. As much stuff as you can get prior to coming to the edit station, and the better quality, the less pain you'll have. So quiet locations are really important, having a good sound mixer if you can. Some interview techniques for the editor. Get those questions from them. If you didn't do the filmmaking specifically and you're just editing somebody else's work, get the interview questions from the client. That'll really help you edit, because you'll start to prioritize those out. and develop those sub-stories. And a lot of the time, obviously, you're going to be working with your client, and they're going to be driving you through, but you want to make sure that while you're working with that client, you follow up with them periodically. And there's a great example from Ed Catmull from Pixar. And every time Pixar, every single day, instead of waiting, until everybody's done with their own work to view it and to show it, Ed Catmull and Pixar brings everybody together, all the animators, and they show their work every single day. And that way, if there's a mistake, they catch it, they move on, they get rid of the embarrassment. Don't be afraid to go to your client. Sometimes it's not always the case, depending on how the client's personality is and how they work with you. But it's not a bad idea to check up with them periodically and build a relationship with them. This is going to help you in the long run. That way, you don't make a bunch of things that you think are the way that you want it, and it's not the way the client wants it at all, and you have to start from scratch on a lot of things. And this is just very basic, but make sure you check on the desired frame rate and resolution output of your source before you start editing. It'll just help you get everything organized. So those are just some basic tips. And what we're going to do is talk a little bit about those sub-stories and working on a longer term project, but I'm going to kind of talk about those details in this edit. So we have our interview here laid out on the timeline. And one little shortcut I forgot to mention to everybody last week that I set up that's in that custom keyboard shortcuts that I sent out in class 2 is the bracket keys. The left and right bracket key, actually, I've mapped to set my work area bar up here. And your work area bar is what's rendered and what is when you actually render out the clip, or when you actually export out the clip. This is what is rendered or exported. So I can set my in and out point brackets to where I want them to be. So I'm going to set them to the beginning and the end. And if you're working on a long project, you want to start to develop separate timelines for separate interview questions. And this will really kind of help you. Like that leather project I was telling you about, I had questions for parents and questions for the parents or the family or values or different things like that. And those were all grouped into different sequences or different sub-stories. And then those sub-stories, once I have those all edited down, I can start to put those into my main edit. And I have it kind of structured. You kind of want to think about interviews and developing your story like a podcast. That's the way I talk about editing at first. So if you listen to really good podcasts like This American Life or some of the great podcasts on FX Guide, Red Center, and whatnot, you start to see that you don't need video to tell a story. And that's obvious. I mean, we've been telling stories through books and things for years in different ways, but really, if you ever watch a really good video, you can almost turn off the video, listen to the audio, and really still feel the impact of the video. Now, obviously, when you turn those visuals back on, if it's edited really well, that's just going to bring that extra layer of home to you. I mean, but don't feel that you have to get everything all together. I always start out with just my interview first. And I always start out with just my audio first. That's why we're covering that. I'm going to go over actually picking out the soundtrack next week. A lot of people wait for the very end to put their soundtrack on, and I just never really agreed with that because you don't get the real feel of how things are going. But the longest process sometimes is really cutting down the interview. Like I said, if you have 20 hours of interviews, you have to spend 20 hours of your life going back through all those interviews. And especially if you weren't there to film it in the first place, if you're the editor, you have to sit through that stuff for the first time. And you don't want to waste that first time. You want to get things organized off the bat. You don't want to sit there and go through 20 hours and then have to re-go through 20 hours because you weren't doing anything. You were just sitting back and listening. So the best way to do that is get those interview questions, figure out what the story is, and then start to cut those interviews down. So what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate our interview main here. Just right click and select duplicate. And I'm going to call this intro. And I am going to open this up by, drag that back under sequences. I'm going to open this up by double clicking on it. And I want to select this and drag it down until it's highlighted down below the other interviews. So I have an interview up here and interviews. I have my main interviews up here and I have my intro interviews down here. So this is anything like he's talking about that's introing up the video that I plan on doing. So I'm going to just delete everything out of here. And I want to duplicate intro by right clicking and selecting duplicate. I'm going to call this gear. And the same thing, I'm going to double click on this. It's going to show up down there. And then I want to right click one more time, duplicate. I'm going to call this outro or ending or however you want to do it. And as we go through this interview, if we find out any other themes that were asked that we want to start to subcategory out, you can. This is one of those kind of setups. We only have about 10 minutes of interviews, so you don't need to do this. For something smaller like this, you can kind of develop this chronologically down the edit. But for longer term projects, I'm showing you this workflow because it'll really help you out. And you can do the same thing when we go over B-roll. We have all this B-roll here we have to cut down, and you're going to kind of go through the same thing. So interviews is normally one of the longest processes. And what you do is you just start to play through this stuff. So you want to make sure your video one and audio one are selected here.
Hey guys,
I'm going to constantly hit my R key to set my where my endpoint is actually going to start. So he messed up there the first time. I'm just going to go back.
Hey guys.
So I hit my out point where I wanted it, go back, set my endpoint, and hit the X key, and that's going to get rid of that spot.
Hey guys, I'm James Douglas. We're here in my downtown.
This first edit is going to be pretty rough. You don't have to get everything perfect. I'm going to go through some of this just so you can watch how to quickly get through this stuff.
Photographing a little bit of a test, doing some fashion. I know most of you guys see my work and it's motorcycles and skiing and advertising, but now it's I'm getting around and doing some more work, getting a little bit more out there. And I'm doing a test today with a bunch of models and some stylists and some makeup artists, and we're here and we're having a great time in the studio and doing some good work.
Alright, so that's the first soundbite. I'm going to hit the B key, and that's going to make a cut there. And I'm going to Apple X and Apple V this down to the intro section. So I'm going to already start to develop that. That intro, there's parts of it that were kind of weak. Parts of it that were a little bit strong that we might be able to use for sure. But essentially, you kind of want to get a feel. You don't want to cut too much out. It's kind of like if you ever edit photos in Lightroom. You want to go through everything first, kind of roughly, and then you want to start to tweak each time a little bit more until you get exactly what you need. So this is just the first time through. This is 10 minutes, so I can be a little bit more lenient, but I definitely want to get rid of things that aren't strong. You don't have to think right now about editing out all the ums and ands and getting the cross dissolves and the audio levels, everything perfect yet. You just want to get it to an average thing, tone that you like listening to, and get the audio set up to where you can edit. It's always good to kind of listen to some of these interview questions.
Today we.
So once you listen to this interview question, you kind of get an idea what the next answer is going to be. Because obviously, if you didn't shoot it, that'll help you with the edit.
Today we, we're doing a lot of white background, which is pretty standard, but it's really hard to do. You got to do it right, and we're using, to get that really unique look, I think we're using some modifiers on some white lightning strobe equipment, which is great. We're using the White Lightning X1600, and which is perfect for studio indoor lighting. It's not too much, it's not too little. You got a lot of really, really minute controls for it. And we've got a 7-inch reflector, and we've got an 84-inch umbrella that we're using to provide a really soft, even light across our models. Models today were also provided by Icon and Mint Modeling.
All right, so we kind of changed subject there at the end. So
across our models.
So I'm going to hit the B key right there. I'm going to cut this section to gear. He's talking about gear there. And he starts to then talk about
models today were also provided by
some of the models and who they're provided by. So that's going to fit better into the intro.
Models today were also provided by Icon and Mint Modeling. They were so gracious as to lend us a couple of their girls to do a test and hopefully get some really good work and some good portfolio shots for everybody and hopefully learn a lot.
All right, so that was more talking about the models. So we're going to create actually another sequence right here. Duplicate this outro and call this models. And that'll be another section of our edit. And so I'm just copying and pasting these things out as I come down the line. So this is the nice thing about Premiere with these dynamic windows is you can set them up however you want and kind of go through these tabs.
Well, Avril, what's your last name? I'm going to plug you. Avril Hall. And then Tracy what? Franklin. And Kate what? Yeah, today I've called in a couple of my friends.
All right, so we get rid of all this, just in and outs, and cut that out.
Yeah, today I've called in a couple of my friends. Kate Powell from Powell Styling is here. And Tracy, oh crap, what's it again? Franklin. Okay. Today I've called...
So we messed up that part a little bit, so we're going to cut that out.
Today I've called in a couple of friends of mine I've worked with. Kate Powell from Powell Styling and Tracy Franklin. They're here taking care of some wardrobe needs that we've had. Also Tracy, also Avril. Okay. Also...
So he messed up there again, but... You know, I obviously didn't start from the beginning because this is editing, so...
Taking care of some wardrobe needs that we've had. Also, Tracy.
So let's cut it there and bring this into talking about the models. He's talking a little bit about the fashion designers and stuff too, but it'll kind of fit under this section.
Okay. Also, Avril Hall is...
So we'll just kick it back up with also.
Also, Avril Hall is here, and she's bringing in her hairstyling and some makeup skills to these girls, and we're getting some real good work, and we're having some fun, and yeah.
I'm cut this section out and move it down here. Oops. And so this is one way of working. A lot of people might work in their source monitor a little bit more and start to in and outs and cut them down. I find working in the timelines is a lot more productive just because I can zoom in and out a lot quicker, get down in there, figure out where everything's at. So I'm going to continue editing all of this down into the different groups. I hope that everybody does the same. You will have this content to work with. And that'll get us better prepared for next week when we start to talk about the audio and getting the audio precise for the interview. Now you can see here quickly there are some issues that I talked about before. This interview is more run and gun style, just myself filming all this in only a few hours. So the color correction is going to need some work because this background, I'm going to white this out. But it's a good test for us to work through Colorista and some other tools to get this better. There's some issues with the audio, some background noise going on, but we couldn't clear everybody out of the room. It was just too much going on. So I got him to a location that was about as quiet as we could. I had his model lights on him, which was very handy to have, just so I could light his face up, and you can see that in his eyes a little bit. So this will look completely different, but once we work through the color correction and different things of the edit, but it's a good challenge for us all as we work through this class. So talking more about the audio, we're also next week going to get our soundtrack developed. So I challenge everybody this week to go to audiojungle.net and start to listen to some tracks you think might work. One thing that I always do is I pick out my B-roll and I just lay it all out on the timeline. And I listen to some of my interview, and then I actually start to listen to some different audio tracks that might work with my edit. And so we'll actually do that next week and pick out something that kind of gets the feel of fun, relaxed, people having fun on set, people getting their makeup done, and just some of the photos and having a good time. And Audio Jungle is actually a really cool place. If you guys know any other ones, post them in the forum of royalty-free music. These are about $14 or so a piece, and you can use them in your projects, and it's really great. So I'm going to pick out a couple songs. We're going to go and add that to the edit as well, kind of feel the pacing. So far, I'm kind of feeling a nice little intro with some graphics, moved into James's intro, into some, like a little music video piece that's maybe 20 to 30 seconds, very strong, of them getting ready and getting prepared, cutting back to James talking a little bit about his studio and the story with some B-roll over it, and maybe ending with the montage of them modeling with the final photos in it, kind of kick back up the tempo a little bit, out to an outro. And, we'll use some titles and lower thirds and things like that as we work through the project. But as for right now, we're going to get the audio locked in with the music and kind of feel it out there, but really kind of go into some of the main details on how to sync your audio and how to set cross dissolves and how to use the fill left and fill right effects and some of the denoiser effects and things like that to get our audio just perfect and our interviews just perfect, so then we can move on to our B-roll. Because once again, it's like you're editing a podcast, and once you get everything locked in with your interview, then you just fill in the blanks with the B-roll, and it's much easier from that point on instead of trying to work chronologically down the timeline. So if you guys have any questions, I look forward to hearing them in the forums and answering them. And I look forward to seeing how you guys cut down your edits. So please post some short videos of your interviews that are cut down from 10 minutes and cut them down to 30 seconds to a minute if you can, or however short or long you think will work for the way you want to edit this piece down. So thanks everybody, and have a great day.